The streets were alive with the sound of roaring engines as a group of bikers fed through the city, their motorcycles slicing through traffic like wild animals on the hunt. Among them was a man who stood out, not because he was the fastest or the best rider, but because of his attitude. He was the kind of person who didn't care about rules, kindness, or the feelings of others. His name wasn't famous, and he wasn't a hero, just a rough biker who enjoyed making trouble. Unlike most bikers who rode for freedom and adventure, he rode for the thrill of control. He loved the sound of people moving out of his way, the nervous glances from pedestrians, and the way dogs on the street would flinch when he passed. But flinching wasn't enough for him. He had a bad habit, one that made even some of his fellow riders uncomfortable. Whenever he saw a dog on the street, whether it was a stray or someone's pet tied outside a shop, he would kick at it as he passed, just to watch it run in fear. To him, it was just another way to show he was stronger, tougher, and in control. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the streetlights flickered to life, he rode alone through a quiet part of town. His tires screeched as he came to a stop near a small cafe, where a few customers sat enjoying their meals. Right outside, resting peacefully on the sidewalk, were two well-groomed dogs. They weren't bothering anyone. One was lying down with its head resting on its paws, while the other sat upright, calmly watching people pass. The biker smirked. He loved moments like this, moments when no one expected trouble, when he could do whatever he wanted and ride away without a care. Without hesitation, he lifted his boot and swung it hard at one of the dogs. A sharp yelp filled the air as the dog jumped back, startled and in pain. The other dog immediately stood up, barking defensively, but the biker just laughed. To him, it was nothing more than a joke. He revved his engine loudly, drowning out the angry murmurs from a couple of onlookers, and sped off into the night, feeling no guilt, no second thoughts. What he didn't realize, what he couldn't possibly know, was that these weren't just any dogs. They belonged to someone who had been watching from nearby, someone who wasn't just going to let it go. As the biker disappeared down the road, a man stepped out from the shadows, his sharp eyes locked onto the departing motorcycle. He kneeled down beside his dogs, gently running a hand over the one that had been kicked, checking to make sure it was okay. His face remained calm, but his jaw tightened. Jason Statham had just watched everything, and he wasn't the kind of man to ignore something like this. The night air was cool, but there was a strange heaviness in the atmosphere. The street was quieter now, except for the distant sound of traffic and the soft rustling of leaves. The two dogs, who had been resting peacefully just moments ago, were no longer at ease. The one that had been kicked still flinched slightly as Jason Statham ran his hand over its side, checking for any signs of serious injury. Its eyes, usually full of life, looked confused and hurt, as if it didn't understand why someone would do that. Jason didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His grip tightened slightly as he stroked the dog's fur, feeling the tension in its body. The other dog stood beside him, ears alert, still staring in the direction the biker had gone. It wasn't just a pet, it was a protector, always ready to stand up for its companion. Jason slowly looked up at the security camera mounted on the side of the building. He knew it had seen everything. He wasn't angry in the way most people might be. He wasn't the type to shout or make a scene. No, his way of dealing with things was different. Controlled, precise. And right now, he had only one thing on his mind: finding the man who had done this. Inside the cafe, a couple of people had watched the incident, shaking their heads in disbelief. One of them, a young man wearing a leather jacket, hesitated before stepping closer. "Hey man, that was messed up," he said, nodding toward the dogs. "Some guys think they can do whatever they want just because they're on a bike." Jason turned his gaze toward him, his expression unreadable. "You know him." The man shrugged. "Not personally, but I've seen that bike before. Loud engine, custom paint. He hangs out with a group near the old warehouse a few blocks from here." Jason gave a small nod, as if filing the information away. Then, without another word, he stood up and gently tugged on the leash, signaling the dogs to follow him. They obeyed immediately, but the one that had been kicked still walked a little slower than usual. That was all Jason needed to see. As he walked away, his mind was already working. He didn't need revenge. That wasn't his style. But there was one thing he wouldn't tolerate: people who hurt the ones who couldn't fight back. He had spent years training, pushing his body to its limits, preparing for situations that required strength, skill, and strategy. But this wasn't about a movie scene or a stunt. This was real life. And in real life, actions had consequences. The biker might have thought he could ride away without a second thought, but he had made a mistake, a big one. He had hurt the wrong dogs. And more importantly, he had done it in front of the wrong man. Jason Statham was going to find him. And when he did, the biker would learn a lesson he would never forget. The gym was nearly empty as Jason Statham walked through the doors, his 2 dogs trotting beside him. The place smelled of sweat and determination, the scent of iron weights mixing with the faint hum of music playing over the speakers. Most of the regulars had already left, but a few dedicated athletes remained, focused on their late-night workouts. Jason didn't stop to talk to anyone. His mind was elsewhere. He led his dogs to a quiet corner and crouched down, carefully checking the one that had been kicked. Though the dog wasn't whining anymore, Jason could see the way it favored one side, moving just a little slower than usual. His jaw tightened. He had trained his body to endure pain, but his dogs, they trusted him to keep them safe. Someone had broken that trust. After making sure they were settled, Jason stood up and pulled out his phone. He had already spoken to the cafe owner, who was more than willing to share the security footage. Within minutes, Jason had a clear view of the biker, his face, his bike, even the way he moved. It was more than enough. He zoomed in on the motorcycle, noting the custom design. That was the key. In the biking world, custom work meant personality. It meant identity. Someone would recognize it. Jason made a quick call to an old friend, a stunt rider who had worked with him on several films. "I need a favor," Jason said, keeping his voice calm. "You know a guy riding a custom black and red chopper? Loud engine, rides like he owns the streets." There was a short pause before the voice on the other end responded. "Yeah, I've seen him. Guy's got a reputation. Likes to show off. Hangs around the warehouse district with a crew." Jason's lips pressed into a firm line. "That's all I need. Thanks." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He didn't need to rush. He didn't need to chase. The biker wasn't going anywhere. Jason turned to his dogs, giving each of them a reassuring pat. "Let's go," he said quietly. They responded instantly, their tails wagging slightly as they followed him toward the exit. Outside, the city was alive with lights and sounds, but Jason barely noticed. His focus was sharp, his steps steady. He wasn't angry. Anger was reckless. This was something else, something colder, more controlled. The biker thought he had gotten away with it. The city lights flickered as Jason Statham drove through the streets, his grip firm on the wheel. He didn't need to rush. He had all the information he needed. The biker wasn't expecting anyone to come after him. That was his first mistake. Jason had spent years in the world of action, both on screen and off. He knew how people like this thought. A man who acted tough, who enjoyed making others feel small, usually believed he was untouchable, but in reality, no one was. As he approached the warehouse district, the sound of revving engines filled the air. The place wasn't abandoned. It was alive with activity. A group of bikers had gathered, their motorcycles lined up in rows, their laughter and conversation echoing in the night. Some of them were fixing their bikes, others were showing off, revving their engines just to hear the power beneath them. Jason pulled over a short distance away, stepping out of his car with quiet confidence. His dogs, knowing they were on familiar but serious ground, remained inside. This wasn't their fight. This was his. He walked toward the group, his steps steady, his eyes scanning the faces. It didn't take long to find the man he was looking for. The biker stood near the center, talking loudly, laughing as if the world belonged to him. He had no idea what was coming. Jason didn't say anything at first. He simply approached, his presence alone drawing attention. The laughter faded slightly as some of the bikers noticed him. He wasn't one of them, but he wasn't afraid either. That made them curious. The biker finally turned, a smirk forming on his face. "You lost, mate?" he asked, his tone full of arrogance. Jason tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "You hurt my dog." The biker frowned, confused at first. Then he laughed. "Oh, that was just a mutt on the street. Don't get all soft on me." Jason didn't move, didn't react. He simply let the silence stretch between them, his eyes locked onto the bikers. The tension in the air shifted. Some of the other bikers exchanged looks, sensing something was off. Then Jason took a step closer. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "You think you're tough because you ride fast, because you pick on the ones who can't fight back." The biker's smirk faltered slightly. "Hey man, it was just a joke. You're making a big deal out of nothing." Jason's gaze didn't waver. "It's not nothing." The group was completely silent now. Even those who had been joking around moments ago had stopped to watch. They didn't know exactly who Jason was, but they could tell he wasn't just some random man looking for trouble. He carried himself differently, like someone who had been in real fights, the kind that didn't end with laughter and high fives. The biker's fingers twitched slightly. He was starting to realize his mistake, but it was too late for regrets. Jason Statham had found him. And now he had a lesson to teach. The biker's smirk faltered as Jason took another slow step toward him. There was no anger in Jason's expression, but there was a quiet intensity in the way he moved, in the way he looked at the man who had kicked his dog. For a moment, it felt like the world had slowed down. The sound of engines roaring in the background seemed distant. The conversations around them faded into nothing. All that was left was the two men standing in the middle of the circle, and the tension that hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. The biker shifted on his feet, his eyes flickering nervously, as Jason stopped a few paces away. He had no idea who this man was, but something about the way Jason carried himself made him feel small. He wasn't used to being on the defensive. Normally, he was the one who made others feel uneasy, who commanded respect with his loud voice and reckless attitude. But now, in front of this calm, collected stranger, he felt out of his depth. His bravado was slipping away, piece by piece. "So, what do you want?" the biker asked, trying to regain some control over the situation. His voice was rough, but it wasn't as confident as it had been moments ago. "You gonna lecture me or something? I don't have time for that." Jason didn't answer right away. Instead, he took another step forward, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he examined the biker. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was just a quiet moment of understanding that the biker hadn't expected. Jason wasn't like the others who simply let things go. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wasn't about to let the biker's actions slide either. Jason's voice was calm when he spoke, but there was weight to his words. "You think you're tough, huh? Kicking dogs for fun, acting like nothing matters. Like you can do whatever you want." His gaze never wavered from the biker, his tone unwavering. "That's not strength. That's cowardice. Hurting something that can't fight back. That's not tough." The biker took a step back, his chest tightening. For the first time, doubt started creeping in. Jason didn't raise his voice, didn't act threatening, but there was something in his presence that made the biker realize just how wrong he had been. He had thought kicking the dog would make him feel powerful, make him feel like he was in control of everything around him. But now he was starting to feel like the one who had lost control. Jason paused, letting his words sink in. The bikers around them had grown quiet. They'd seen their fair share of bravado, seen countless confrontations, But this was different. Jason wasn't just speaking from a place of anger. He was speaking from a place of understanding. He knew what it meant to stand up for something, to protect what mattered. The bikers could feel it, even if they didn't understand it fully. The biker tried to shake off the unease building inside him. But Jason wasn't finished yet. "You know," Jason continued, his voice steady, "it's not just about what you did to my dog. It's about how you carry yourself. You think you can hurt something weaker than you. And no one will care. But that's where you're wrong." The biker clenched his fists, trying to hold on to his defiance, but it was slipping away. "I wasn't hurting anyone," he muttered, but even he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. Jason shook his head. "You were hurting someone. You were hurting a living creature that trusts people. That's not a joke. That's a problem." The silence was heavy now, almost suffocating. The biker felt his anger turning into something else, something he couldn't quite identify. He had expected this to be just another interaction, another moment of power where he got to walk away unchallenged. But now, with Jason standing in front of him, calm and resolute, he felt like he was being exposed. The crowd around them shifted, some of the bikers glancing at each other, unsure of what to do. They weren't used to seeing someone like Jason, someone who didn't engage in petty drama, who didn't seek to show off in front of the crowd. They could feel the authority in his presence, the quiet strength that didn't need to prove itself. Jason took a step back, not out of defeat, but because he had said what needed to be said. "I'm not here to fight you," he said, his voice still calm but firm. "I'm here to show you that there's a better way. You don't have to walk around hurting others just to feel strong. You're better than that." For a moment, the biker stood there, his mind racing. The anger he had felt just moments ago was gone, replaced by something else. Something he didn't want to admit. Regret, maybe. Or maybe it was just the realization that he had been wrong. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to fix it. The following days passed quietly, but the encounter with the biker lingered in Jason's mind. He had said what needed to be said, but it wasn't about the words. It was about the impact they left behind. Jason didn't expect the biker to change overnight, nor did he expect an apology. He knew real change took time, especially for someone who thought they could get away with whatever they wanted. Jason's dogs seemed to sense the difference in the air as well. They were back to their usual playful selves, but there was a certain peace that had settled in Jason's heart. He wasn't just protecting them physically anymore. He had shown the biker that there was more to being strong than showing off or bullying others. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it was hard. But despite the calm, Jason knew he couldn't forget the bigger picture. He had done what he could for the dog that had been hurt. But what about the others? What about the countless animals and people who weren't as fortunate as his dogs, who didn't have someone to stand up for them when they needed it most? He had always believed in taking action, not waiting for others to fix things. And so, in the days that followed, Jason began quietly working on something bigger. He reached out to local shelters, to animal advocacy groups, to anyone who could help bring attention to the issue of animal cruelty. He didn't want to just move on from the incident. He wanted to make sure it didn't happen again. It wasn't about revenge or even punishment. It was about awareness. It was about teaching people to respect others, no matter how small or vulnerable they might seem. Jason knew he had a voice, and he wasn't afraid to use it. He wasn't going to let the biker's actions define the story. He was going to write a new chapter, one that brought change. Meanwhile, the biker was still grappling with the encounter. He hadn't expected it to affect him the way it did. At first, he had tried to brush it off, to convince himself it was no big deal. But the more he thought about it, the more Jason's words rang true. He had always acted out of anger, out of a need to prove something. But in that moment, when Jason stood in front of him, calm and confident, the biker realized how empty that mindset really was. He didn't know if he could change overnight, but he knew he had to try. He started spending more time with his bike club, but this time, he wasn't just trying to prove himself. He was listening more, trying to understand what respect really meant. It was a slow process, but little by little, he began to see the value in changing his ways. And every time he thought back to that night, to the man who stood in front of him without raising his voice, he felt a pull toward a better version of himself. Jason, on the other hand, didn't expect a thank you or recognition. His focus had never been on praise. It had always been on making the difference. He continued to spread the message, using his platform to speak out against cruelty in all its forms. He shared stories, he volunteered, and he worked to create a community that valued kindness and respect. Soon, a small movement began to take shape. People were starting to listen, not just to Jason, but to the idea that they had the power to make a difference in the world. The biker wasn't the only one who had felt the weight of Jason's words. More and more people started speaking up, sharing their own experiences, and coming together to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The biker's life began to shift in ways he hadn't expected. He began volunteering at an animal shelter, offering to help with repairs, and donating what he could. He wasn't perfect. He still had his rough edges, but he was trying, and that was all that mattered. He wasn't the same person he had been before that night. And in a way, Jason's quiet lesson had planted a seed in him, a seed that was growing slowly but surely. For Jason, it wasn't about getting recognition for his actions. It was about knowing that something had changed. He had made an impact, not just on one man, but on an entire community. And that, he realized, was all he needed to know. As he drove home one evening, his dogs in the back seat, he thought about how far things had come in such a short time. He had set out to protect those he loved, but along the way, he had helped others find their own path to kindness. Jason didn't need a medal or a thank you. The knowledge that his actions had made a difference was all the reward he needed. As the weeks passed, things began to settle into a new rhythm. Jason continued to focus on his mission, working quietly in the background, knowing that change didn't happen overnight. The world moved fast, and sometimes it felt like people were too busy with their own lives to notice the smaller things, the little acts of kindness, or the moments when someone stood up for something that mattered. But Jason didn't mind. He wasn't in this for the attention or the praise. He was in it to make a difference, even if that difference was small. His dogs seemed to sense the shift in the world around them. They were still as playful and joyful as ever, but there was an added sense of calm to their behavior. Maybe it was because they had been through their own share of hardships and were now surrounded by love and care. Or maybe it was because they, like Jason, understood that sometimes the quietest moments could have the biggest impact. Jason spent more time with them, taking them on long walks through the city, letting them explore new places, and teaching them new tricks. The simple moments brought him peace, and he felt a deep sense of fulfillment just knowing they were safe and happy. But his thoughts often drifted back to that night, the night when everything had changed. He wondered what had happened to the biker. Was he sticking to his newfound path, or had he slipped back into old habits? Jason knew it wasn't easy to change. Old ways were hard to break, especially when they had been so deeply ingrained. But he hoped that somewhere inside, the biker was still remembering the lesson Jason had quietly taught him. It was never about perfection. It was about trying, about taking one step forward instead of 2 steps back. One afternoon, as Jason and his dogs walked through the park, something unexpected happened. A familiar figure appeared in the distance, a man on a motorcycle, wearing a leather jacket and sunglasses. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the bike immediately. It was the same one the biker had been riding that night. The man slowed as he approached, stopping just a few feet away from Jason. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Jason couldn't read the expression on the man's face, but he saw the uncertainty in his eyes. It was the same man, but he looked different, more grounded, less brash. Jason waited, letting the silence hang between them. Finally, the man spoke, his voice softer than it had been that night. "I just wanted to say, thank you." he said, his words slow but sincere. "I don't know what I was thinking. I was out of line, and I've been trying to do better since then." Jason simply nodded, watching as the biker shifted uncomfortably, as if unsure how to continue. "I've been working with the animal shelter," he added, his voice filled with a quiet pride. "I help out whenever I can. I've learned a lot about the way we treat animals, and it's made me realize how wrong I was. I never should have hurt that dog." Jason felt a small smile tug at the corners of his mouth. The change was slow, but it was there. He had seen enough to know that real transformation wasn't always visible right away. It was in the small actions, the willingness to learn, to try, to acknowledge past mistakes. "You're doing the right thing," Jason said simply. There was no judgment in his voice, only encouragement. "It's not about being perfect. It's about making the effort to be better every day." The biker looked at him, his expression softening. "I just wanted to tell you that I'm sorry for everything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I won't make that mistake again." Jason didn't need any more words. The apology, the effort to change, it was enough. He could see that the biker was genuinely trying, and that was all that mattered. With a final nod, Jason turned and began walking away, his dogs following closely behind. He didn't need to hear any more or ask for anything in return. The simple act of the biker taking responsibility for his actions was enough to show that change was possible, even in the most unlikely of places. As Jason walked home, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew that he had made a difference. Sometimes, all it took was one quiet moment to set a chain of events into motion. A lesson learned, a heart change, a life redirected, and that was enough for him. He could hear the soft patter of his dog's paws behind him, and he smiled. They had their own little world, and in that world, everything was as it should be. But in the world beyond, things were changing, slowly but surely. Jason had played his part, and now it was up to others to continue the journey. He didn't need to know how far it would go. All he needed to know was that it had started. As time went on, Jason's life continued at a steady pace. He focused on his work, spent time with his dogs, and kept a quiet eye on the world around him. But even though life seemed calm, something inside of him was stirring. He knew he had done something good by standing up for his dogs and showing the biker a better way. But he also knew that there was so much more to be done, so much more that could be changed if people just cared a little more, if they paid attention to the little things that mattered. The experience had left him with a sense of purpose, something deeper than just protecting his own. It was about making the world kinder, about showing others that strength came from compassion, not cruelty. It wasn't always easy to see the bigger picture, but Jason believed that if he could touch one person's life, change one attitude, then it was all worth it. One day, as Jason was out with his dogs, he passed by the same animal shelter where the biker had started volunteering. He had seen the place many times before, but today something felt different. There were more cars parked outside, more people standing by the entrance. Jason slowed his pace, curious about what was happening. As he got closer, he noticed a group of people gathered around a large banner. It was a community event, raising awareness about animal cruelty and promoting adoption from local shelters. Jason stopped for a moment, watching as people milled around, chatting and signing petitions. There were pamphlets being handed out, and the air was filled with the hum of conversation. It was a good turnout, but what really caught Jason's eye was a familiar face in the crowd. The biker. He was standing by one of the tables, talking to a few people and pointing to a large poster about animal rescue. He was wearing the same leather jacket, but there was something different about him now. He was smiling, genuinely engaged in the conversation, and his body language was relaxed. No signs of the brash attitude he had worn before. Jason felt a warmth spread through him. It was clear the biker had taken Jason's words to heart. He was no longer the man who had kicked a dog for fun. He was someone who had learned, who had seen the importance of kindness, and was actively spreading that message to others. Jason smiled to himself, feeling a sense of quiet pride. This was the change he had hoped for. The biker saw Jason standing at the edge of the crowd and waved. Jason nodded back, walking over to join him. "Hey," the biker said with a grin. "I didn't think I'd see you here." Jason chuckled, shaking his head. "I wasn't planning on it. Just happened to pass by." The biker looked around at the event, the people talking, the dogs being adopted, and the kids petting the animals. "It's kind of amazing, isn't it?" he said, his voice full of genuine admiration. "I used to think I knew everything, but I was wrong. This is what really matters." Jason nodded, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Yeah, it is. And you're a part of it now. It's not about being perfect. It's about making the effort to be better, day by day." The biker smiled, his expression thoughtful. "I've learned that. It's a lot harder than I thought, but I'm doing my best." He paused for a moment, then added, "I've even started helping out at the shelter, talking to the new volunteers. I never realized how much these animals needed people who cared. I thought I was just doing it to make up for what I did, but now, it feels right. I feel like I'm actually making a difference." Jason's heart warmed at the words. He knew that change wasn't about instant results or quick fixes. It was about the slow, steady process of growth and understanding. The biker had come a long way, and Jason was proud to see it. "You are making a difference," Jason said quietly. "You've come a long way, and that's what matters. You're showing others that there's always room to grow, that it's never too late to change." The biker nodded, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "Thanks. I don't know if I'll ever be able to make up for what I did, but I know I can keep trying." Jason clapped him on the shoulder. "That's all anyone can do." As they stood there, talking and watching the people around them, Jason realized that he had already done something important. He had been the catalyst for change. He had given someone the chance to do better, to learn, to grow. And in turn, that person was now helping others. Jason didn't need any more recognition or thanks. The ripple effect of his actions was more than enough. He had made a difference, and that was what truly mattered. As the sun began to set, Jason turned and walked toward his car, his dogs trotting happily by his side.